For 292 days, two great armies crouched in the earth and stared at each other across a wasteland of mud and splintered timber. Shells screamed overhead from morning until dark. A man who lifted his head above the parapet for 3 seconds might never lower it again. Tens of thousands died, and yet, week after week, the lines barely moved. A few hundred yards here, a blood-soaked ridge there, nothing that looked like victory. History remembers this as the Siege of Petersburg, the longest of the American Civil War. The campaign that finally broke the Confederacy. But here is the strange thing. When you look closely at what actually happened on that ground in Virginia, the tunnels, the trenches, the machine-like grind of attack and counterattack, a troubling question rises out of the smoke. What if it wasn't really a siege at all? What if everything you've been told about Petersburg is built on a word that doesn't fit? To understand how the Civil War truly ended, you first have to understand Petersburg. In the summer of 1864, the war was supposed to be over. It wasn't. And the reason had a name. A small, smoky, unglamorous railroad city 23 miles south of Richmond. Petersburg was not the Confederate capital. It was something more important, the place that kept the capital alive. 5 railroads converged there, threading north into Richmond and south into the heart of the Confederacy. Down those tracks came everything Robert E. Lee's army needed to keep fighting: corn, bacon, ammunition, salt, shoes, men. Petersburg was the lung through which Richmond breathed. Cut that lung and the capital would suffocate. Lincoln understood this. So did Lee. Petersburg was not the prize. It was the throat of the prize, and whoever closed his hand around it would decide the war. The man reaching for that throat was Ulysses S. Grant. In the spring of 1864, Grant launched the Overland Campaign, a relentless drive to destroy Lee's army of Northern Virginia once and for all. What followed was some of the most savage fighting the continent had ever seen. In the tangled thickets of the wilderness, the woods caught fire and wounded men burned alive where they fell. At Spotsylvania, soldiers fought hand-to-hand for 20 hours straight at a salient forever remembered as the Bloody Angle. Then came Cold Harbor, where Grant ordered a frontal assault that cost thousands of Union lives in less than an hour. Men pinned scraps of paper with their names to their coats before going in, certain they would die. In a single month, Grant lost roughly 50,000 men. The newspapers called him a butcher. But Grant had learned something his predecessors never had. Lee could not be destroyed in one grand, decisive battle. He was too skilled, too entrenched, too defensively brilliant. So Grant changed the question entirely. He stopped asking how to beat Lee and started asking how to starve him. The answer was Petersburg. In June 1864, Grant did something audacious. He slipped his entire army across the James River on a pontoon bridge over 2,000 feet long, one of the great engineering feats of the war, and lunged for Petersburg before Lee even realized he was gone. For a few breathless days, the city lay almost open. It was defended by a thin, improvised force under General P.G.T. Beauregard, in some places barely 2,000 men holding works built for 10 times that number. The road to Petersburg and to the end of the war stood wide open, and the Union let it slip away. Exhausted, poorly coordinated, and haunted by the slaughter of Cold Harbor, Union commanders hesitated. Corps that should have stormed the lines paused. Officers waited for orders that came too late. Beauregard bluffed magnificently, stretching his handful of men thin, lighting extra campfires, buying hours with sheer nerve. And into those stolen hours marched Lee's veterans, filing into the trenches just in time. The window closed. The chance was gone. Both armies dug in, and here is where everything you think you know begins to fall apart. Say the word siege, and the mind conjures something ancient. Stone walls, a castle ringed by an enemy. Catapults and starvation. A waiting game, where one side simply sits outside the gates until the people within run out of food. Patience is a weapon. Petersburg was almost nothing like that. There were no walls to surround. The Union never fully encircled the city. Lee kept supply lines open for months. There was no passive waiting. Instead, the two armies carved the Virginia countryside into a monstrous web of trenches that eventually stretched more than 30 miles, from east of Petersburg all the way around to the south. Zigzagging earthworks, firing steps, bomb-proof shelters dug deep into the clay, forts bristling with artillery, belts of sharpened stakes and tangled obstacles planted in the no-man's land between. This was not the end of an old kind of war. It was the birth of a new one. Soldiers fired from behind earth parapets at an enemy they often never saw. Sharpshooters with telescopic sights turned a careless glance into a death sentence. Mortars lobbed shells in high, lazy arcs to drop straight down into the trenches. Both sides launched attacks not to win the war in a day, but to seize one more rail line, one more road, one more mile of the enemy's flank. Anyone who has seen photographs of the Western Front in 1916 would recognize Petersburg instantly. The mud, the duckboards, the shattered trees, the endless parallel scars in the earth. 50 years before Verdun and the Somme, on the soil of Virginia, the world was getting its first terrible glimpse of what industrial age war would become. And for the men inside those trenches, it was a slow descent into hell. In summer, the heat baked the clay, and the air swarmed with flies feeding on the dead. In winter, freezing rain turned the trenches into rivers of mud that swallowed a man's boots. The trench for weeks at a time, sleeping in burrows scraped into the trench walls, sharing their misery with rats and lice and disease. Dysentery and fever killed quietly, without glory, claiming more men in some stretches than enemy bullets. There was no front and rear, no safe place to rest. A shell could find you while you ate. A sniper could find you while you slept. One Union soldier wrote that the strain of constant danger wore on the nerves worse than any open battle, the knowing every single hour that death might come from a direction you couldn't see. Then, in the darkness beneath all of it, someone had an idea that belonged to the future. A regiment of Pennsylvania coal miners proposed digging a tunnel, a long shaft running from the Union lines, beneath the deadly open ground, right under a Confederate fort. They would pack the end with gunpowder and blow a hole straight through Lee's defenses. Their commanders were skeptical. Army engineers insisted a tunnel that long couldn't be ventilated. The miners did it anyway, with ingenious homemade air systems and improvised tools. By late July 1864, they had dug more than 500 feet underground and packed the chamber with 4 tons of black powder. Before dawn on July 30th, they lit the fuse. The explosion tore the earth open with a roar heard for miles. A whole Confederate fort, guns, men, and all, vanished into the sky in a fountain of dirt and fire, leaving a crater more than 150 feet long and 30 feet deep. The southern line was ripped wide open. For one shining moment, the road to Petersburg lay undefended once more. And then it all came apart. The Union plan had called for specially trained troops to lead the assault, going around the crater to seize the high ground beyond. At the last minute, those men were pulled out and replaced with soldiers who had no idea what to do. Instead of skirting the gigantic hole, they poured into it, down into the crater's steep sides, where they milled in confusion, unable to climb out the far wall. The Confederates recovered from their shock with terrible speed. They lined the rim and fired down into the trapped mass below. One Southern general called it a turkey shoot. What had been the greatest opportunity of the entire campaign became a slaughter pit. Among the worst hit were the United States colored troops, black soldiers who fought with desperate courage and were murdered in numbers even after trying to surrender. By midday, it was over. Nearly 4,000 Union casualties. The line sealed. Grant called it the saddest affair he had ever witnessed in the war, a chance lost not to the enemy's strength, but to his own side's failures of leadership. So the grinding resumed. And this is where Grant's true genius revealed itself. He could not break Lee's lines by force, so he stopped trying to. Instead, month after month, he reached westward, extending his trenches, throwing his weight against one railroad after another. The Weldon Railroad, the Boydton Plank Road. Each thrust forced Lee to stretch his shrinking army thinner to cover the new ground. It was arithmetic as warfare. Grant could replace his losses. The North had the men, the factories, the endless supply. Lee could not. Every Confederate soldier killed, captured, or starved was simply gone. As the rail lines were severed one by one, the food stopped coming. Lee's men were reduced to a handful of cornmeal a day. They froze in rags, and then they began to vanish, not in battle, but in the night, slipping away home as hope drained out of the cause. By the spring of 1865, desertion was bleeding the Army of Northern Virginia to death. The siege that was never a siege had become something worse for Lee. A slow strangulation he could see coming and could not stop. The end came at a crossroads called Five Forks. On April 1, 1865, Union forces under Philip Sheridan smashed the far right of Lee's overstretched line, capturing thousands and cutting the last great railroad into Petersburg. The thin gray thread finally snapped. The next morning, Grant ordered an all-out assault along the front, and the Confederate defenses, held by too few men over too many miles, gave way at last. Petersburg could not be saved. That night, Lee sent the message he had dreaded for 10 months. The lines were broken. Richmond must be abandoned. Confederate troops marched out into the dark as their own government set fire to the warehouses behind them. The capital of the Confederacy fell. Lee fled west with the ghost of an army, searching for food, for trains, for any path that wasn't already closed. There were none. Grant's cavalry raced ahead and cut him off. Hungry, surrounded, and out of options, Lee surrendered at Appomattox Courthouse on April 9, 1865. And here is the final truth Petersburg leaves us with. The Civil War did not end because of one brilliant battle or one heroic charge. There was no single decisive blow. The war ended because Petersburg had already decided it, through 9 months of trenches and tunnels and hunger and attrition that ground the Confederacy down until it simply could not stand. By the time the breakthrough came, the outcome was no longer in doubt. It had been settled, slowly, in the mud. The siege lasted 292 days, but Petersburg was never just a siege. It was a war of endurance, of engineering, of logistics and relentless pressure, a contest decided not by glory but by who could outlast the other in the earth. By the time the final breakthrough came, the war was already over in everything but name. And as those exhausted armies climbed out of their trenches for the last time, they could not have known what they had truly witnessed. Not the end of an old war, the first shadow of every war to come. Petersburg didn't simply close the Civil War, it opened a door onto the future, and showed the world the terrible shape of the century ahead.